Welcome to Food, Wine, and Whiskey, a podcast about having fun conversations on tasty dishes, vinos, and spirits from around the world. Rob is your host. He is an avid home chef, WSET Level 2 award in wine, and a whiskey drinker and collector. Time to set the table. Here's Rob.
Hey everyone, welcome back for another episode. We have a treat for you today. I have two fantastic guests on the show. And as you saw by the topic of this the title of this episode, we are talking about wine scores, the scoring systems that you'll see when you go out and look at bottles of wine in a shop or in a magazine or something like that. And I'm confused by these scores, and I assume a lot of our listeners and other wine lovers out there could be as well. So I thought maybe we'd have a conversation, dive into this topic, and see if we can't dissect it a little bit so that we can understand better how we're supposed to, one, understand this system, and two, apply it to our purchasing decisions. So first, let me start with both of our guests today. We have Susan Lynn, Master of Wine. How are you, Susan?
Good. It's lovely to be here with you. Thank you very much.
Great to have you. And back on the show for another appearance, Bob Paulinski, Master of Wine.
Hey, Rob. Thanks for having me back. Happy to be here.
I want to say a big thank you to both of you for coming on and having this conversation with me. It's something that for a few years I've just kind of struggled with as I've gotten more into wine. I think early on, you just looked at numbers, and the bigger number you could find at a price point that you liked, you bought it, and you thought it was going to be a really fantastic wine. Sometimes that was the case. Sometimes it wasn't. So I'm looking forward to diving in and having this conversation with both of you.
Likewise.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, so before we get started, Susan, first time on the podcast. Thank you again for coming on. But, folks, I always like to ask the question. I think the journey in wine, and people hear me ask this of a lot of our guests, the journey in wine can be different for everybody. What was you're obviously Master of Wine, so you're at the pinnacle of education in wine and knowledge in wine. But what was that journey like for you? How did you find the passion and the love of wine and deciding to take that journey to Master of Wine?
Well, thank you for asking. And again, it's exciting to be on your show. It's just really a wonderful topic that you chose today. But before we dive in, thank you for this wonderful question. I never thought growing up that I would ever have a career in wine, actually. Music was my main passion, and I still perform and play a lot of music and wine events and programs and research is what I focus on. But what got me into wine actually was when I was very young, when my maternal grandparents used to live in the United States, when close to my family, and we would go over to dinners, and I would always see my grandfather pouring something that made people really feel special. And a real sense of conviviality would appear at the table after the children would have their meals, and they would say, "Okay, children, now you can go into the living room and watch TV." And then the adults would actually start having their real evening. And I didn't want to go because something special was happening. I wanted to see what was happening at the adults' table. And my grandfather was the one who showed me what a wonderful beverage. He always had cognacs, brandies, wines from Bordeaux and Napa that he would showcase and pour for family and friends. He was always very generous with people, and I always saw the effect that he had, and it always stayed with me. And so I wanted to continue to study it just on my own. And later, playing piano in bars and restaurants too, growing up too, I saw that magic happening again in hospitality. And so it continued to stay with me. And it wasn't until I finally started doing the WSET, and in level 3, I was recruited by one of my study mates, and I changed from high tech over to wine, and it's been really wonderful. So it's an ongoing journey, and regardless of whether one is a master of wine or not, I'm a student for life. There is so much to learn all the time, and I so much enjoy meeting new people and talking with everybody that I know, and how much we can learn and share with each other.
Oh, that's awesome. That's great. Bob, for those who haven't listened to previous episodes, go ahead and tell us again your quick journey, because yours was kind of an unexpected finding of wine from a gentleman who I'm going to let you tell the story. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I'll make the story short. I've been in wine my entire working life, so 40 plus years. And originally, I had a job in a wine shop as a teenage kid. I was the guy who was bagging ice, and I stocked shelves and did all the grunt work that a kid would do. And in my late teens, there was a gentleman there who was maybe in his mid 60s at that point. And we hit things off. We were friends, and spent about 4 years with that person. And he was very much a wine nerd. And we would spend a month focusing on Tuscany, and then another month on Veneto, and so on. And just the more that I dug into the topic, the more I thought this is something that I want to make, have as part of my work life. And I owned a wine retail shop, opened it in my early 20s, had it for almost 20 years, sold it just before I became an MW. And I've had a number of corporate roles where I've moved all around the US. I've lived in Australia for a couple of years. And then most recently, when I moved back to the States, I've recently started an import company, which is off to a sensational start. And I work on some contract projects. And about a year ago, I started a YouTube channel. So I've gone from being an entrepreneur to doing the corporate to having more of an entrepreneurial slant. And for me, that's my comfort zone. I like the entrepreneurial piece.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's dive into today's topic, wine scoring systems. And if I can ask you both, when did this come about? When did scoring systems start to kind of arrive on the scene, and why? Was it intended initially for consumers, or was it intended for buyers and other people when they were, where did this come from, and how did it start? What's the purpose?
So
Susan, you want to start?
I guess I will. Thank you. So we're talking in terms of the actual, the numbers that are given, right? You're talking about.
Yeah, the numbers. Yeah.
Right. So I think, to step back just a little bit, people have always wanted to know, what are the good things, what do people recommend? And we could probably go back and start and say, okay, AD 23, Pliny the Elder, right? He was the one writing about wines because he traveled so many places. He was very influential, and he got to taste wines all the way from all the far reaches of the Roman Empire. And so, you could say that people have always looked to those who seem to have a good grip, on something, to be able to say, okay, I'm going to look up to this person or organization to understand, what might be a good thing. And in fact, his notes on the classification systems are still, very influential for today in Bordeaux and other parts of France, and certainly in Italy and Spain. But yeah, no numbers back then. It was maybe more descriptions of the wine, descriptions of the land from where it came from. And then, if you fast forward many, many, many centuries, and you still get people who were really just giving descriptions. And these are pretty upper crust, right? Those who could afford the finer things in life. And then we started seeing more things like, stars. Right? Sort of, is this a 1-star or 5-star? Similar to kind of how you see hotel ratings, right? So people could get sort of an idea of, is this a, you could say drink or sink, right? Or is it somewhere in the middle? And then when we talk about these points that we look now, that's a fairly recent phenomenon of, and Bob, feel free to jump in anytime if you would like, but, in the 70s, was really when Robert Parker came in and said, okay, we're going to do a 100-point system based on kind of the American school system out of 100 points for people to understand, what is a wine that is of good quality, of good balance, and had different aspects baked into the score, like complexity, freshness, overall quality, longevity, those sorts of things, intensity. But there also has been a 20 scale score that was used more outside the US. And some people have really credited Jancis Robinson, MW, with popularizing that. But that's kind of in a nutshell to say that it is quite recent, but people have always wanted to know, what is a good wine? What is a good anything, right? And so I think it was a natural evolution for a scoring system to come into play so that, as the world gets bigger and there's a lot more touch points, we can say, okay, well, if we don't get a chance to talk to a wine expert, how do we just know what wine we should buy? And I think numbers can be an effective way of guiding people in that respect. But it also depends on who's behind the numbers. So, Bob, if you have anything to take away from, take on from that.
Yeah. So, thanks for that, Susan. So broadly speaking, within the U.S., the 100-point system has been embraced to a large extent, and there's plenty of commentary that ties this to Parker in the 70s. There's actually some conflicting evidence that says that this system existed in other places earlier. And when I lived in Australia, the claim was there was an individual by the name of Dan Murphy who claims that he had some system that was very similar to this much before Parker. But I think part of the appeal for the system is it's perceived as being something that provides clarity to a topic that's inherently very complex and convoluted and fragmented. So bringing some sense to it with a simple score for many people has become extremely appealing. And I think back to myself back 35 years ago, let's say, when I was really starting to be immersed in wine. This was back in the day where Parker would release books that were like a doorstop, and I had a stack of these. And for me, it was a quick, simple resource, and I thought it provided some degree of clarity and security. And perhaps it did, but as I started to, as my knowledge base on wine grew and my confidence grew in terms of navigating all the complexity of the wine world, I found that the scores were, while helpful, they only told a small part of the story. And it's the commentary that, in conjunction with the score, that gives you much more of a complete picture. So it's an interesting situation where Susan mentioned that many years ago there was this commentary with no scores. And then it seems like the pendulum swung full to the other side, where it's the score with oftentimes with an absence of that description. And I think it's really a combination of the two that's really critical. Now, with Parker, when he came on the scene in the late 70s, I think it was just a perfect storm for him, because shortly after that, Bordeaux had the 82 vintage, which is a highly acclaimed vintage. And for some, they would say it's on the short list for the great vintages of the last century. So having those scores out at that point was something that was embraced, and many large retailers in the U.S. started to use this as their way of communicating the value of whatever assortment they had. So, and from there, it keeps expanding. You have more individuals who are involved in the process, and I'm sure we can get into some of the details. But at this point, I'll just say the point system has gone from I don't want to say starting point, but it was very embryonic back 40 years ago, and now it's become something that's rather mainstream and accepted, but I think oftentimes not clearly understood.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I am in wanting to have this conversation. Don't get me wrong; I think the scoring system is beneficial and is a good tool for consumers to have, as long as we understand the criteria for how those points are tabulated, and then how it's applied or who's applying it, and how much do how much confidence do you have in that person and their ability to give it a good grade, or how are they judging that wine? And I agree with you also that, back in the day, I remember it used to be, if you wanted to know about a restaurant, you looked up a food critic. And now you just get on Yelp and see how many stars it has, right? Or how many reviews it has with 5-star reviews or 4-star reviews. So I agree with that as well. before we go too much into the details, I wanted to put up on the screen kind of what we're talking about, so folks who watch the video can kind of see the scoring systems and things that we're mentioning here, because I thought this was interesting to talk about. You mentioned the Jancis Robinson and her getting credit for the 20-point scale. Some may call it a 12-point scale because that's kind of where it starts. But it's just simply, and all I could find, you guys tell me if there's something different that I'm missing in what I found as far as how the points are applied, what that means. So 13 being faulty or unbalanced, 12 being faulty or unbalanced, 13 borderline faulty or unbalanced, 14 points out of 20 gives you dreadful or deadly dull, 15 gives you average, 16 points gives you distinguished, 17 is superior, 18 a cut above superior, 19 is a humdinger, and 20 is exceptional. And I'm going, okay, that still doesn't give me a lot of clarity on what I should be looking for or understanding to know how to apply that point to a wine. Is that a fair question to ask as a consumer if I'm using this point system?
I'm sorry, Susan, if I can go. So what I would say to this is, first off, you made the comment that Jancis was connected to the original with the 20-point system. It actually existed well before Jancis.
Yeah, I think she helped, broaden the audience understanding or exposure to it, rather. Yeah. Yeah,
absolutely. So this 20-point system is something that some countries, the UK being one, has broadly embraced. So I think it's really just a matter of familiarity and comfort with the system. But this really is not much different than the 100-point system, because in many cases, you can have wines that will be 17 and then a fraction of a point. So it's really not a whole lot different than the 100-point system. But the way that she has laid this out in the descriptors that apply to each of the scores, I don't know this for fact, but I take it this is really her personal way of approaching it. I don't know if this is, and I don't believe this is the same scale with the same descriptors for everyone who uses that system. I think she's personalized it a bit.
Okay, that makes more sense, and I can understand that. But let me ask you this. The 100-point system, I read and had an understanding that other than England, globally, it was kind of adapted and embraced for the most part. Is that not accurate, or is it more of just an American thing?
I think the 100-point system has largely been embraced since the advent of the Robert Parker phenomenon, and I think it's because it's probably quite easy to think about in the human mind as to convert to percentages. Whether that actually is a reflection, that the rating itself is a reflection of a percentage or not, is another story. However, but I think it has caught on in a way because it is easier for people to think about it in that capacity. But I agree with what Bob said about the 20-point system not being that different from the 100-point system. If you think about it mathematically, and you think about how much what part of the actual number scale is being used, which is not that much of it, right? If you think about it. So the 100-point scale starting from, a base of 50, but we never see that, right? We never even see that, much less anything below 50. That's just not a thing, right? And so that always made me think, as somebody with coming from kind of a high-tech background, like it always made me think, okay, so we have like three different, if you forgive me for a moment, we'll have three different, main systems for looking at temperature. Like we have Fahrenheit, we have Celsius, we have kelvins, right? But when you have kelvins, it's like, why are there so many numbers? Like room temperature is 294, right?
Yeah.
Kelvins. But why do we have that many?
Yeah.
Oh, it's measuring not only, things as cold as in the middle of, somewhere in the Arctic, or something that is super cold for scientific purposes, to like, the magma in the Earth's core, right? So we're talking about really huge. So if we're talking about that many things, I mean, for a 100-point scale, it makes me think, well, are we measuring all liquids here? Like, are we going from zero or one to all the way to 100? Like, would a salt-based solution be a 2? I mean, like, what does this mean, right? So, but I think, for any regular person looking at it, yes, we don't want to see things that are going to be published being like 50 or lower, or like 12 or lower, on the 20-point system, because we want to know that we're getting something that's at least good, right? If not better than that. And I think that is a natural progression of why we see scores that, people are saying, are scores getting inflated? Are we always seeing higher scores? There are a couple of factors to that. I think, wine quality has improved for sure, and it keeps improving. And I know that Bob can probably speak to this too. In judging numerous and various wines for competitions, we often see wines that are just, such high quality. They're well made, but they have different characteristics. And so I agree with Bob that the commentary is so important to what goes along with that score, to try to understand, where is this wine from, and what might be its characteristics, not only in the region and the grape variety or varieties, but in the context of the producer as well, and the quality within that context of perhaps its price bracket, for how it's supposed to be and what its target audience is for. And those are all things that we keep in mind when we're assessing a wine. And so I certainly hope that critics are doing the same. But to your point, there is subjectivity, because this is all, a very sensory experience.
Oh,
Like,
absolutely. Yeah. And
like,
I'm looking forward to getting into some of those things, because I have lots of questions from, the just an average wine guy, and a consumer, and really the systems, all point systems, or any kind of grading systems, kind of talked about it earlier, is supposed to help us make a better purchasing decision. But understanding how to apply this is where I get kind of confused. And I'll tell you, to your all's point, the 100-point system, I don't think it's that different than a 20 or a 5-point system or a 10-point system, whatever system you want to use. But what I did like about the 100-point system, kind of me talking about the 20-point, not understanding how they get to those, putting criteria to get to a point. The 100-point system, I like that, you just get 50 points for showing up. You get 5 points for, meeting a certain level in color, and 15 points for aroma, 20 points for flavor, 10 points for overall quality. So that's the maximum you can get in each of those categories. So at least I know kind of what they're looking at in the wines to, give it points that total a certain number. So I did like that. I don't know that a lot of people know that criteria. And is that the same for everybody's 100-point system? If you see it from, Wine Advocate or Wine Spectator or Jeb Dunnick, do they all use this type of criteria? Do you guys know if this is standard criteria?
No, I wouldn't say it's standard, but directionally it's similar.
Okay.
And Rob, if I'm fast forwarding a bit in terms of what we're going to discuss, I mean, there's one thing that I'd like to say is, when it comes to the critic score, it's not only important to know the score, to know the commentary, but also it really is a benefit in terms of knowing something about that individual that's scoring. And
right.
They may have specific wine styles or types that maybe they're a little more likely to give favorable reviews to. So as you get into this and you really delve into it, I think for many people, they'll find that there's a handful of critics that they know and trust, and they find they're reliable. When you get beyond that, there is some degree of risk in terms of how did that individual come to that final score. And I think with wine, it's something that it's not like picking up a Consumer Report magazine and getting the reviews on the latest washing machines. There's a degree of subjectivity here, and knowing that critic, I think, is really one of the most critical pieces. So for me, there's only a few critics that I actually pay attention to, and beyond that, the scores, yeah, they might have some influence on me, but it's really a minor consideration. So
Okay.
I think knowing that critic is very, very important.
Yeah, I
Yes.
agree with that. And I was going to mention that as well as we get into this conversation, because, but go ahead, Susan, you had something you were going to add to that?
Oh, yeah. To the point of, are all the 100-point rating systems created equal? And necessarily the answer is no. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, to Bob's point, because there is a bit of subjectivity, and that is good because this is a sensory experience and people have different preferences. And I think it's wonderful that there is such an effort to be able to create some kind of benchmark and some kind of way to allow consumers and curious people to be able to see, what that benchmark might be and how this or that wine might measure in comparison to that benchmark that they've set. So it is critical to know who that critic is and, who's putting those numbers out and what that means to him or her.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting though, because my clients have often said, whose score should I be looking at? And most of them kind of default to the Robert Parker because I think it's had the most precedence and it has set people's expectations more by dint of being probably, one of the first, right? And in that scoring system and the 100-point system and highly publicizing that. But people have said to me, well, it seems like James Suckling has a lot more 100 points, has a lot more that are 95 to 100 and more 100 points. So, what is that? Are these wines really that good? I mean, how come Wine Enthusiast or Spectator has not put out those same scores? And so I encouraged them to take a look, but it also made me go and take a look at, what are some of these criteria? And sometimes it's really difficult to tell. You asked, is there a standardization between those criteria? And there isn't, because everybody necessarily has a bit of subjectivity put into it. But I think it's interesting that I found a quote from James Suckling that said, like, if it's 100 points, it means I want to down the whole bottle. And you know what? That could be different for you. It could be, for Rob and for Bob and for me. But, I know that James Suckling is a really highly respected, a wine expert, and he's an excellent taster. And so I love reading what he has to write along with other critics, but we also have to take that all with a grain of salt or what have you, saying that, wanting to drink the whole bottle, okay, that's fine. It might be different for everybody, but what can we look at in terms of how they're evaluating that wine? And that's where the comments that come along with the score are so important to read.
Yeah. And, on the James Suckling note, Susan, I saw him recently in an interview, and I was kind of looking up things and people's thoughts on the 100-point system. And he was answering a question related to that about why does it seem that you give more 100-point scores? And I liked his answer. His answer was, look, a lot of people are just looking at the quality and certain, measurable things in the wine that add up to a number. But he said, in my later years, I've gotten to the point where emotion is a part of enjoying wine. And if a wine hits me emotionally, makes me think of something or a memory or takes me somewhere, it gets a few more points for me. And I went, I've heard people give him a hard time about that. But after hearing his explanation, I go, I kind of appreciate that.
Indeed. And I think it's really ironic that as, people in the wine industry, as wine professionals, especially, having gone through the Master of Wine program, we spend so much time trying to be as neutral as possible and to be assessing wines in a completely neutral environment and state, which is hardly, when does anybody enjoy wine in a neutral state these days?
Right.
That's really knows about. So I find it really, really interesting, but I also find it a very, very, it's a wonderful thing to be able to want to do, to reach that goal and say, I want to be able to tell people and help people assess a wine like through my efforts. But I love the fact that Suckling does add that bit of emotion into it, because wine is an emotional thing.
Bob, you ever add any emotion to your wine evaluation?
Oh, I'm a very emotional guy. Yeah. No, I think the point that was raised, I think it's certainly relevant. Wine is, it's very emotive. It can take you to a specific place. It can, lead to some recollection of some sort of good experience that you've had. So there's certainly an emotive link there. But another point that I'd like to raise on this is, and we've touched on it briefly. Okay, you're tasting these wines in this very neutral sort of environment, which is not the reality. But there's also factors like what type of glass are you using? How do you feel that day? What's your surroundings like? I mean, there's a lot of factors that can come into play in terms of your perception and your enjoyment level of a specific wine. And also when scores are provided, you understand that wines have a life cycle, and it'll vary by the different wine. And really it's like this, bell-shaped curve. And when a review is provided, it's a snapshot in time. And so if you try this wine today and I give some sort of assessment, I give something 90 points, let's say, well, 6 months, a year, sometime further down the road, that wine is going to go through various stages of evolution, and its assessment could be very different. So it's a bit of a moving target.
That's a good point. I remember reading I forget which publication it was, but they talked about that when they're tasting wines on site and it's a barrel tasting, they give it a range, a 4 to 5 point range, because they feel like at some point it's going to fall within that once it actually gets bottled. And I was like, well, that kind of makes sense. I didn't think of it that way initially, but because I've seen spreads before, and I was like, okay, why didn't we land somewhere on this? And that made me kind of understand what they were doing, where that tasting or that review may have come from. That now I knew it probably came from the barrel, not from a bottle that had been, ready to be served.
Yeah, and I think sometimes those ranges might come from that, but also because they're not quite sure exactly where that wine is going to be going, because they know they have a feeling that it can get that much better. And so that's why sometimes you see the plus on there. Often see like 95 plus, and people are like, what is that? Like, why isn't it 95? Mm-hmm. Is it 96? Like, which one is it? Right. But 95 plus, could mean that it has a lot of potential there. It's a wine that, and it usually, if you see that, it means that whoever reviewed it thinks that the wine has a long cellaring potential as well. So, but the thing is, so that might be helpful. But for me, like, as Bob was saying, when we're assessing a wine, for competitions or panels or whatever it might be, we just try to take into account, who this wine is for. Is it meant to be drunk right now and enjoyed, bought and enjoyed immediately, a fresh light style, or is it something that is really going to last a long time? And so all those factors are going to go into, for that wine in its context, and it's for intended profile and character and audience. Is it a great quality wine in that context? And I think, again, quality and context is really, really important when thinking about wine, because wines have so many different styles. Like, what makes a great Bordeaux is not necessarily what's going to be the same factors that make a great Burgundy, or, so these are things that hopefully that, the critics can give confidence to consumers in whatever category or style of wine that they are buying or looking at, that is a great wine, or scored within that context of where that wine is coming from. And
so you're saying, Susan, not all 95 point scores are equal.
Perhaps not in the sense that, it means exactly the same things. Like if you say in like a Napa Cab, you want a lot of intensity, you want a lot of longevity, you want, a good amount of a really well integrated, but perceptible oak, things like that, what have you. But for a wine that is meant to be, a very light styled, say it's a white wine from northern Italy, it's something that is meant to be enjoyed in sort of the near term. But certainly there are ageable examples too. And so it always helps to know what to read in those comments, what a bit about that wine. I think a great description will always include not only what the characteristics, the aromas, the flavors, the mouthfeel is, but where that wine is coming from and where it would be going. If you say drink now, fresh style, light style, then that could be a great wine. And it's a 95 for being a nice, light, fresh wine. Instead, a 95 for an Napa Cab would be like, it's going to cellar for a long time, but that white wine, you're not going to want to cellar, right? So there's different criteria than that. And so again, those comments are so important, especially if, you're not sure about what style that wine is. It's new to you. You can really learn from these comments that come with the ratings. And so I think that's when it can be really wonderful. But if you know the wine category, say if you really love Bordeaux or you love Napa Cabs or Burgundies, and you're pretty familiar with that style of wine, then you can kind of maybe look at those numbers and have a quicker snapshot of it, and that can be helpful too.
That's a very good point, Bob. I wanted to ask you. We go to as a consumer, as a shopper, we go to wine shops or we go to wine stores, big box stores, wherever it might be, or even on the bottle in today's world, you see that score. Who decides that a wine will be scored and judged and then given a number?
Well, for starters, there's a good percentage of wines that are never reviewed. So, there's a section that you can just remove. But generally, the way that it happens is the brand owner, the winery, who's ever the decision maker for that specific wine, will choose where they want to submit the wines for review. And, again, this will vary based on who the individual is. But generally what happens is the submission will be made to a publication, for instance. That publication will go through their process, and the scores will be provided at some point down the road. Now, with some publications, they may focus on a specific region where, Susan mentioned Napa Cab, for instance. There may be times where those types of wines are submitted for review. Other publications will take the wines as they come. But it's really the brand owner, which is often the winery, or it could be the importer, who's ever controlling that brand is the one who will submit the wines.
And that makes sense because in the world of, if you make something good, a wine, and you're the winemaker, you're the producer of this wine, and you think it's fantastic, you want other people to try it and spread that word. Ultimately, they want to sell bottles of wine. And if it's really good, they believe that, and they can get it to folks who are going to have a voice in the wine community and be able to validate that, yeah, you really made a great bottle of wine here, and spread that word. I mean, that's ultimately what they want to do. And as a consumer, I want that information as well, because I want to know that and then be able to seek out and find and enjoy and share with my friends and family those bottles of wine as well. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. Rob, there was a point that I believe you raised as we were preparing for this conversation, and it touches on this point a bit, but I believe you asked the question, what would the difference be between a 90 and an 89 point wine? Because for many, that 90 is a tipping point where you're getting into something that is very special. So I have an answer to that, and whether or not Susan or most anyone listening would agree. But for me, the difference between an 89 and moving into the 90 plus really comes down to two things. For me, the very best wines always have a sense of place. So there is something about this wine that takes me to a specific region. So it has that character where it's reflective of the place where it's produced. And then beyond that, and this becomes a little bit gray, but what I also look at is level of complexity. Is the wine nuanced? Is there some sort of layering effect where, okay, I find this very compelling because there's a good deal of nuance to the wine. Now, something that's an 89, in my view, is very nice. It's enjoyable. It's well made. There's no flaws. If it's a single varietal, it's true to what that varietal is, and it ticks a lot of the boxes. But it's not quite getting to the point of, okay, there's something special here that links it back to the place, and somehow, some way, it may fall just a bit short in terms of that complexity. For me, that's the dividing line between the two.
How about for you, Susan? How do you go from an 89 to a 90? What would be that criteria?
I really agree with a lot of what Bob said. And Bob, you put it very, very succinctly and very elegantly. I think it's just absolutely, there has to be a something that makes you not just think, okay, this is a decent wine. They're solid, right? I feel like things in 89 is a solid wine, right? You're not going to find fault with it. It's good. It's good, and it's going to be
tastes like a Cabernet. Yeah,
it has typicity, as Bob mentioned, in terms of like where it comes from and the grape variety or varieties or the blend style. And like if it's a Sauvignon Blanc, it has a good amount of freshness and zest to it. But does it have something that tells you this is a Marlborough, Sauvignon Blanc, or versus a Sancerre from France, right? Or from, is it a Fumé Blanc style from Napa, California? Is there something about that Sauvignon Blanc that, that gives you a sense of, oh, this is coming from somewhere. It's not just like generic Sauvignon Blanc or something. It gives you a sense. And then there's also that nuance, I think, is a good way to put it, because when we think, sometimes we can get hung up on the word complexity. I think it's a great word, but sometimes it can be a little confusing, because sometimes there are styles of wine that are meant to be very straightforward, right? And some wines that aim for a lot of, evolution on the palate, changing from the front to the back and in the end, but sometimes there are wines that are very simple, but it doesn't make them a lesser wine. Is just in that style of wine. So nuance, I think, Bob, was a great word. Is there something that gives you pause and makes you want to savor it on your palate a little bit more, because there is some sort of layering. Mm-hmm. There is some sort of, in the way that the wine was made, it was so well made in the balance that the acidity, the mouthfeel, the freshness, and the amount of fruit or other characteristics are very much in harmony. And I think that's something that anybody can get a sense of.
So now I'm going to ask you the big questions. That's going from 89 to 90. And if we look at the 100-point system, we're thinking, 85 to 89 is in that good to very good wine. Well, let me ask this question first, and I'm going to get back to the question I have. The first question would be, 85 to 89 is still thought to be a good to very good wine, something that we should enjoy and be able to drink as consumers. But you never see those scores anymore. I mean, you don't see them posted. Everything you see is either 90 or above that. That's the first question. Why do we not see something that says 87, 88? I mean, in school, that's a solid B. That's not bad.
Yeah, and I think in a lot of academic systems, at least in the United States, an 86% or above is an A, right? In some cases.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a really great question. I think that, again, as mentioned earlier, the quality of wines has improved a lot, but at the same time, we still see differences. Between that solid wine and the exceptional, getting into this exceptional territory, but I think people love to see superlatives, and I think it just continues to keep going. We love superlatives. I mean, it's a Marvel universe, right? So I think do those ever get published then, or do they as Bob mentioned, a lot of wines aren't even reviewed, right? And they still have a market, and so it's a really good question. Sometimes I wonder whether they, do show, or they decide to spin it a different way. And I think in wine competitions, metals are really great for doing that, because metals you can be a silver, you could be a bronze, and you can still proudly display that medal, but you're not going to be like, I'm an 80 something. People don't see that, and I think that's actually really powerful. So, the medaling system could be really good. And I think you often see in big box retailer stores too, and like the little neck things on little shelf toppers on the bottles, and near them they'll say was awarded, the silver medal or the bronze medal, right? So,
Bob, you have something you want to add?
Well, Rob, just and again, this is going to link back to my decades in this business, but I think back 35, 40 years back. I remember when the Wine Spectator was on like newspaper, and when you flip through the pages, your fingers were black and all of that. That's back in a day when you would find scores that would be 60 or wines that had some serious flaws. And to Susan's point, I think there's a few factors that come into play here. I certainly do think that wine is better today than it's ever been. But the other is, I think people want to know, what is it that I should be searching out? And I think that narrative is just much more compelling for most individuals. The level of 90 plus scores, there's no doubt that number has increased, but there's a myriad of reasons of why that's happened. And I think also that'll vary a bit based on the source. So again, I keep going back to if you're a consumer and you're trying to make sense of all of this, certainly the score is one consideration. The commentary that goes with that score is critical. And eventually, if it's a topic that you continue to dig deeper into, knowing the critic and putting those three pieces together, it'll put you in the position to have the most favorable result, where you'll have a good experience with the money that you've spent. So I think there's really three factors that come into play.
Okay, to my second question that I had before I backed up and asked that one, we went from an 89 to a 90, and you gave some, what your process is for making that determination. How do you go from, that 90 to 94 category to that 95? What are you looking for in a wine that's going to make it jump from that, outstanding wine to that, just fantastic classic type of wine?
I think there are a number of factors that go into it to build off of, those two, the sense of place and the sense of nuance that you can get on the wine. There's something that is going to stand out in a way that is less nuanced. It actually will kind of hit you in a way that what you know about that wine style, what you know about that region, and you know about that, the great variety of varieties. And actually, it not only is typical, it is classic, but yet there's something else that makes it unique in its own way. Like, there are personalities within wine regions and wine styles, and it will have a distinct personality, and that shines through. And even if it's young, because often we taste wines that are, younger in their lifespan, you can tell that it's going to go very far. And you look for those factors. You look for those factors of evolution and longevity. And even in a wine that is meant to be drunk sooner, like maybe a light white wine. There are wines that maybe, like, I haven't tasted so many different wines from. Like, I was actually assessing white wines from Taiwan at one point. And it was just so fascinating that even within that flight, there were wines that really stood out as having a tremendous amount of character. Right, you'll be able to do that through the balance of all the factors in the mouthfeel, the freshness, the flavor characteristics, and how it sits on the palate. But what it does to you, and that actually does have a bit of not just a visceral moment of where it's hitting you. If it triggers something, it might trigger something emotional at this point, because let's not lie, we're human beings, but I try to take that into account and look at all the different factors that are objective. But it will strike you in a certain way as having a really unique character after having fulfilled all those other baseline numbers and gone above and beyond.
Bob, anything for you? Or did Susan nail it?
No. I think she did nail it. But it really does come down to, and again, I'm speaking for myself, and I think generally this would be true. It gets down to the level where you have this nuance, this character. I mean, there are certain markers in wines that'll set it apart, and it really is just, you've elevated the game through something, and that'll vary, based on what the wine is. And I mean, it's a bit of a gray way of putting it, but there are wines that have that it factor, and it's one of these things when you taste it, you know it, and that's a relatively small slice of the wines that are out there. But a lot of it too, there's another factor that comes into play. I mean, for one, when I'm assessing wines, I'm looking for something. If it's a single varietal, I want it to be true to that varietal. I want it to be have a sense of place, so it ties back to a specific region, for instance. But those are the starting points. As you start to move up, that triangle gets very narrow as you get up to the top. So you start to go through the process and say, okay, these are wines that would be maxed out at maybe in the mid 90s versus the upper 90s. And it really, there's a personal preference piece that comes in, because look, we can assess wines in terms of, is there balance, is there length? There's things that are measurable, like alcohol, acidity, oak, that sort of thing. These are the foundational blocks. And as you keep moving up, it just becomes, I don't know how to term it other than saying, having that it factor, or saying this wine is above and beyond the mass. I'm probably not stating this all that well, but
let me say what I think I'm getting from what you're telling me, that kind of back to the James Suckling, him saying there's some emotion. He described it as some emotion. Maybe here I'll say it's subjective. We get to a point where we're given a wine, we're evaluating a wine, and there's some technical kind of objective things that we have to grade on. And then beyond that, if it hits all those marks where you want it to, beyond that, now, subjectively, you can start to look for things that you are finding in the wine that create whatever kind of response or emotion for you, that you go, hey, this really hits here. And what I would say is, when you're looking at a wine score from one person, if you see somebody who gives it a 94, somebody else gave it a 93, somebody gave it a 95, you go, okay, that's a pretty solid wine. But if you had 93, 92, and then a 97, you're going, wait, what's off here?
See, I think when that happens, well, there's a few reasons of why that could happen, but one sometimes comes down to style preferences. So for instance, if you were to look in, I don't know, let's take the Northern Rhone, for instance. You have a couple of styles that can be very different than one another. They can both be superb in their own right, but you have a very old school way of producing and one that's much more of a modern way. Without getting into a whole lot of detail, there's this clear delineation between the two. Now, for the individual who is assessing that wine, they may have a more positive feel towards one of those two options. The likely outcome is the score for that style will tick up a few points. This is why I keep going back to knowing and being familiar with the person who's assessing the wines. If your preferences align with theirs, it brings you tremendous value.
So that could also be true. Well, let me say it this way. It could be that you have more than one palate critic that you follow for their assessment of wines. Your example being Rhone Valley. You could have somebody that really just is in Rhone all the time and knows that region like the back of their hand, and somebody else is, in the Loire Valley all the time, and you're going to go to that person for their evaluation and critiquing of wines from the Loire Valley. Is that something that somebody should consider looking at?
If you're someone who is going deep into the subject, if you find value in, you use the Loire and the Rhone example, certainly it's worth looking into. It really depends on your level of interest. How deep do you want to delve into the topic?
And I'm asking the question from the perspective that somebody who wants to get into wine and learn more about wine and figure out their palate as well as the quality of the wine.
This is the best time if you want to go down rabbit holes. I mean, because with the proliferation of personalities and experts on the internet, you can. I mean, the proliferation of subscription sites actually has really quite taken off in the last decade or so, right? I mean, Jane Anson has her own site now, and of course Lisa Faradi-Brown, MW, with the Wine Independent, and there's just so many examples. I mean, if you want, you can go on social media and see Shiba's sommelier, whether he has 5 bones for a wine or not. I mean, you can just see what style you jive with. There's no better time to be able to search out sort of your identity and personality that that resonates with you online at this point. And there's a wealth of information out there. Like I said, some of the sites that I mentioned there, in addition to sort of the major sites like Wine Spectator and of course Wine Advocate, Decanter, and others. But I think Bob, you put that really well. It's if you want to go there, you can go there. But at the same time, just really read those comments, really read the commentary that goes along with these wines, and you can get a feel for that person's personality and where they're coming from and what their style preferences are. Because it's true, Rob, you were saying earlier, like, what if there was a 90, a 92, and then a 97? How are you going to reconcile those? And that's why we, when we judge wines, we often have panels of three or four people, so that when that happens, we can talk about it and find out those style preferences, or find out what may be tipping one person over the other, and actually bring that back to a more objective benchmark. So, but if a wine critic is doing, the work themselves, then get to know that person's style.
Go ahead, Bob.
No, Rob, I think the other thing to add to this is, look, the wine world is, it's a consumer product, but it is ultra fragmented. And because of that, and I don't care how much of an expert you are on wine, there's always something new to learn, something new to explore. And, the number of brands is just mind blowing. And, keeping it really straight in your head, I don't care what your involvement is in the business. There's always going to be things that you don't know. And if you're someone who's a consumer and you're interested in the wines from Bordeaux, for instance, my suggestion is you connect with some critic who you build a little bit of a track record with, you have some confidence in, and there's a level of security there. Okay, so for Bordeaux, this is what I love, this is what I drink the most, this is where I really want to focus my efforts. Have a resource or 2 or 3 or whatever the number is that you feel comfortable with. That, I believe, is going to lead to the best outcome in terms of being satisfied with the wines that you purchase. So, and again, I think the other point is that Susan touched on, wine quality has never been better than what it is today.
Yeah.
So to walk into a store and pull a bottle off the shelf, I'm sure things can go bad and you may be hugely disappointed. Oftentimes, if it's a store that is It has a good reputation. They have a well-trained staff. I mean, it might be just as simple as you're connecting with that person in the store. You said, look, we had a tasting last week. I tried 20 different wines. I really love these 5. Well, it's you're taking someone else's, their opinion. But if it's a reputable store and, you have a bit of a track record there, for me, I'd say, I'm feeling fairly confident in what I'm buying.
Okay, that's good advice. That makes a lot of sense. Would you also say then, whatever town you're in, because you start talking about relationships, maybe go buy your wine. If you start off buying at a grocery store, I think most of us do. But if you're going to go down the rabbit hole, let's kind of evolve to the wine shop. Where you can build that relationship, that person or those people, multiple employees at that shop could learn your palate and help guide you to finding and exploring new wines.
Hey, I was that guy for 20 some years when I owned a retail store. So, it's very old school. It may be looked at as the dinosaur way of approaching business. Having someone you can connect with that you trust and you build some sort of rapport with, I mean, that's invaluable.
Absolutely.
I'm still that guy. So, for the business that I work with. And so I have had clients who just, who always want to know scores, and other ones who just, they want to talk with me for, quite over the phone or, in person or what have you. They really want to know. They really want to know what, to hear about, what the stories I can tell about that wine or about that region and how I know their palate. And sometimes, the greatest joy for me is to be able to try to get people to try something a little bit different, maybe slightly out of what they've been normally drinking, and see if they make some great discoveries, and just, it's just the most wonderful thing because, there's so much to learn, like Bob was saying, always so much to learn. And some clients say that they don't even want they don't care about the scores. They just want to talk, and they want to make their decisions based on that. And I've even actually, heard from colleagues and also read about in different in wine retail establishments around, the country that say that sometimes they don't actually show scores at all. They don't put those on the shelf talkers. They just have the employees write their own, and they know that they can really be able to showcase wines, whether they've been reviewed or not. It doesn't even matter. It's the wines that they have chosen, and they can be able to hand sell that, have that really personal experience. And when you're something that has a personal connection to it, it can have the potential to mean that much more and have that much more impact on you as the consumer. And that's special.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. Let's finish up this episode with this. Susan, you had touched earlier on the medal system, going to a competition, putting your wine into the competition as a producer and getting a medal, a gold, silver, or bronze. And as we've had this discussion, because I think the listeners are going to go, okay, I do see those at the wine shops as well. How do I evaluate those? Because when we're talking about the scores, part of the criteria or one of the big suggestions is know the critic, know their palate, know what they like and don't like. In the world of medals, how does a consumer at the store look at that and then make a decision? Does it matter the competition that it's in? Or, you don't know who actually was the panel grading the wines to give it that medal. How do you evaluate those wines?
That's a great question. And again, it's not every competition has the same, founding principles, but I would say most of the time, they're the ones that certainly that I can speak for. They're very, very rigorous about making sure that people understand the criteria. These panels understand the criteria for which medals are to be awarded or not to be awarded. So, it really does depend on the competition, but for the most part, I would say that, if you see a bronze medal, that's a good solid wine. You can get pleasure from drinking it. It's going to be awesome. It's a great wine. But then when you move on to the silver, you're starting to get that sense of place and that nuance, right? And then when you get gold, I'm like, that blasted somebody's socks off. That had that it factor, right? Generally speaking. Yeah.
So Rob, it wasn't all that long ago that Susan and I were on a panel, same panel at a competition. And I think it's the only time that we've actually judged together. But I thought it was remarkable. I mean, you assess the wines, and then everyone in the group, there were 3 persons, we all provide feedback. I thought it was remarkable how similar the scores were between Susan and I. I mean, extremely consistent. So
yeah, they were.
When that happens, I'm thinking, okay, we're in sync, we're in agreement. Okay, happy days. Things are flowing along as they should. But you're right. If you're a consumer and you're seeing something that has a silver medal, for instance, you have no clue who the individual judges were. And it's just like when I mentioned, having a score, knowing the commentary and the critic. It's also the same with these various competitions. Is it a reputable, well-run competition? And many of them, and I used to do several of these, and now I do maybe 2 or 3 competitions a year. I really focus on those that I feel have a high degree of integrity. But outside of the system that we're talking about in the U.S. with these competitions, there are places in the world like Australia where these types of state competitions have a huge impact in the wine world. So, these various trophies are given out, and this is high praise when you're scoring well in those types of competitions. So, again, I would imagine your listeners are from a lot of different places. What is the driver in each individual market will vary a bit. So in Australia, for instance, the story is a bit different than what you'll find here versus the UK and so on.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank you both for coming on and doing the episode today. I really enjoyed the conversation, and quite honestly, I've learned a lot on kind of how to understand the numbers that I see as I go shopping for wines, and I'm hoping, and I think I'm quite confident that the listeners have gained this same knowledge from both of you. So I appreciate that very much.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here with you, Rob and Bob. It's always wonderful to have this conversation. We should have more in the future so that we can keep delving in and trying to figure this all out and help each other out.
I would love that.
Yeah, I second that. Susan, thank you. Rob, thanks for having me back. Very enjoyable morning. Much appreciated.
Yep. Thank you both. Thanks, everybody, for listening to this episode of Food, Wine, and Whiskey. And until our next episode, enjoy your next pour.